Professor Vrolchain, when you were beginning to do the work that led to this paper, Fertility, Period Paramount, critique of the cohort approach to fertility, what kind of issues or questions or debates were active in your mind? What kind of issues were you facing?
Well, the work, in fact, arose out of my previous work on a period life table for fertility. That is a synthetic period life table which estimates period parity progression ratios. And that's a piece of work which I did back in 1984-5. And when I was writing this piece of work up, what I had done in this piece of work was to produce not just period parity progression ratios, that is to say estimates of the level of fertility at a point in time, but also estimates of period tempo indicators that related specifically to year by year. So what I was faced with in writing up this piece of work was what looked to me like a fairly complete account of fertility change through time. One had in one and the same measure, in one and the same system of measurement, if you like, both tempo and quantum indicators. And the question that occurred to me as a result of this was, well, what else do you need? Does one need anything else? One had a period measure. It was conventional at the time to suppose that one couldn't actually estimate tempo quantities from period in a period way. It was supposed at the time that the only way that you could really get a proper measurement of the changing tempo of fertility, the changing timing of fertility, was through cohort measures. And here you had the whole thing together in one period measure. So the question that I asked myself was, does one need anything besides period measures if these are the period measures that one has?
So you felt there was a kind of a presumption against period measures, that there was a presumption that only cohort fertility measures could truly indicate something about the tempo.
Oh, that was a very, very strong presumption at the time. As a matter of fact, the presumption was then, and perhaps even still is, that not only were period measures fallacious in relation to tempo, or that they were subject to tempo influences, but that they were actually fallacious as measures of quantum as well. So that is true of the traditional kind of period net measure, but it's not true, I believe, of this new kind of period measure that we can obtain from a period life table.
Okay. So when you were doing the actual work, the calculations and chasing data and that sort of thing, who were you working with? What kind of people were you talking to in the process of writing this?
Well, I think a very strong influence on the work at the time. I was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Centre for Population Studies, which at that time was directed by Bill Brass. And I think a very strong influence on the work at that time was, in fact, was Bill's interest in the whole issue of tempo and quantum measurement of fertility. And Bill, I think, was probably being influenced by Norman Ryder in his turn, and he was also having conversations with Graffini. Bill was a strong influence, but also another person at that time who was a very strong influence was Mike Murphy, who didn't seem to hold very much to the idea that period fertility was actually quite as bad as people seem to make out. He seemed to feel that period fertility was not quite as bad as people thought.
So that there was actually some point to having cross-sectional measures.
Absolutely. There's not only some point, but they seem to be meaningful, and they seemed to be interpretable.
So in a sense, you felt like you were answering a school of thought that had gotten too doctrinaire about their position, or what prompted you to actually write this piece?
Oh, this particular piece. Well,
yeah.
What really prompted me to write this particular piece was the question that I mentioned earlier. What is it that we need besides period measures. If we can get from this system of period measurement, both tempo and quantum components, what use is a cohort? Surely we don't need a cohort at all if this system of measurement provides us with both tempo and quantum measures. And my question was, how is it that there is actually such a strong presumption in favour of the cohort in demography? And what I decided to do, since I thought, since Norman Ryder was the key exponent of the cohort approach, was to read pretty well everything that he had written about period fertility, or about indeed the measurement of fertility in general, the measurement of temporal change in fertility, which of course was a very long-standing interest of his. I mean, it's something with which he started his career, and which has taken really, he has done many decades of research on the subject. And my thought was, well, if there is anywhere that I am going to find the answer to the question, of what value is the cohort to us? What is it doing for us? And why do we need it? And why is it that I think that we don't seem to need it? What mistake have I made? I thought to myself, well, maybe I've made a mistake here. The whole of the rest of the world believes in cohorts. I don't seem to need it because I've got the system of measurement, which has got both tempo and quantum in it, and therefore, the cohort doesn't seem to come into it. It doesn't seem to be needed here. But maybe I've got it wrong. And if I've got it wrong, I'll find out from reading Norman Ryder's work where I've gone wrong.
And had you got it wrong?
I don't think I had got it wrong. This is what the paper is arguing. The paper is arguing, no, the period approach is sufficient in and of itself. We don't need cohorts.
So you went looking for cohort effects.
I went looking for a rationale for the cohort. And it didn't occur to me that, in a sense, there was a whole rationale, that there were two kinds of claim made about the cohort. On the one hand, there was a claim about the cohort as having distinctive cohort effects. Another kind of claim was that the cohort was a form of measurement, that it was an approach, a framework for measurement. And those two claims are quite different. The cohort as a framework for measurement is more in the Haenel tradition. That is what Haenel was putting forward when he put forward the cohort as an approach to measuring fertility in 1947. It was Ryder who added the further claim that, as a matter of fact, cohorts are distinctive in their fertility.
That they have careers, so to speak.
That's right, that they have distinctive fertility careers. And that therefore, because they are distinctive, it is completely false to chop them up into little bits in the way that we do in period measurement. So I was trying to see, well, it didn't occur to me, or I didn't see until I had been really thinking about this for quite some time, that there was a whole range of issues, and that there were those two issues in particular, the distinctiveness of cohorts on the one hand, and the cohort as a measurement framework on the other. The whole thing was really mixed up together at the time in one big sort of soup of as I see it now, misapprehension.
I realize it's a bit premature to ask you about reactions to this paper because it's only been published for less than a year now. But what have you heard so far? What has the reaction been?
Well, it's actually, I've had the best reaction to this paper of any paper that I've ever published. I've had a great deal of positive response to it. I've had congratulatory letters from people, several letters of this sort, which is tremendously encouraging. I've had a lot of positive comment.
What about Norman Ryder? Have you heard
Well,
from
Norman
him?
Ryder was in fact one of the reviewers of the paper. He identified himself in the reviewers' comments that PDR sent to me for revisions after the first draft had been approved, and he had two views. On the one hand, understandably, he rather felt that part of my work, or of the paper, which was critical of the cohort approach, he naturally felt that I hadn't quite got his argument exactly, and that I hadn't quite understood the point. But on the other hand, he was complimentary and positive and generous about the later part of the paper, which attempts to identify sensible approaches to the measurement of period fertility. So he was both critical and appreciative.
Well, that's very interesting. do you still feel that there is not that much to following cohorts, that they don't, it may be a useful measurement strategy, but that cohorts don't empirically really turn out to have much of a cohesiveness to them over time?
I'm certain that the whole question of cohort distinctiveness is a dead duck, that it isn't, it just simply isn't true. People do not behave in a consistent way in cohort fashion. There's no question about that at all. The statistical evidence is very clear on that. On the other hand, the cohort is a convenient way of representing certain kinds of trends. For example, I've recently been looking at trends in the age at last birth. Now there doesn't seem to be at the moment, there doesn't seem to me to be at the moment, any simple way in which one could, any intelligible way in which one could look at trends in last birth in a period fashion. Perhaps one could generate some kind of index. Maybe one could generate an index. But it doesn't seem to me that it would actually make sense, whereas the notion of an age at last birth is almost certainly one which one should consider in a cohort framework. I can't think of any other fertility measure that one should definitely consider in a cohort framework. But this is the only one that I can so far think of that one needs to think about in a cohort framework. All the others, the cohort is simpler for the representation, for example, of timing measures, the mean age at marriage, the mean age at first birth, and so on, mean intervals. It's simpler. But even though the period representation is a bit more complex, it's probably more correct and focuses our attention rather more acutely on the aspects of behaviour that we need to be, and the historical periods that we need to be focusing our attention, our explanatory efforts on.
This really kind of turns things around. We have been told for so long that period measures chop up cohorts, as you say, and give us these false composites of many different cohorts. And it's almost as if you're telling us that a cohort gives us all sorts of false composites of people going through many different periods.
Absolutely.
And conceals a lot of the variability in the lifetime of a cohort with a summary measurement.
Absolutely. One is looking at the wrong thing in looking at the cohorts. The cohort is merely an average, and you've lost all the information by looking at this smooth cohort in contrast to the irregularities, which is where all the information is, in the period dimension.
There's going to be a lot of journalists very unhappy about this because they've just gotten used to things like talking about the baby boom generation and following them along and attributing everything that happens to a particular generation as it goes through life.
Well, yes. I have not got a great deal of, shall we say, optimism that the cohort is going to vanish. I think people like the idea of cohorts too much. They like the idea of a generational effect too much. They like the sense of there being a continuity in a life cycle, which, in a way, the cohort gives you. Too much, I think, to drop the cohort quickly. Nevertheless, I'm hoping that, at least so far as the technical measurement of fertility goes, at least in that area, that there'll be much more attention given to the period approach.
It sounds like we have lots of satisfying controversies to look forward to. Thank you very much.